Faribault's founding is generally celebrated as 1855, the year the settlement was platted. But this year, you'll see signage at Faribault Heritage Days commemorating 150 years. This is not faulty math. This year marks 150 years of Faribault city government, a distinction from settlement and platting. The city received its charter in 1872, a document which continues to frame our development and structure as a civic community. But that still begs the question, why celebrate 1872? People settled in Faribault long before 1872. The town was flourishing and had some municipal organization prior to that. This place was called Faribault for as long as Alexander Faribault resided here. So why does the anniversary of a municipal document merit such commemoration? 1872 was a monumental year of accomplishment for the people of Faribault. The story of how Faribault got to 1872 can explain why we celebrate that year today. In 1896, Mary Mott was 70 years old. She had lived in Faribault since 1856, when she had traveled with a small party of her siblings, her in-laws, and her husband, Rodney Mott. Reflecting on their first impression of Faribault, 70-year-old Mary wrote, "40 years ago, how long and yet how short it seems, we first looked upon Faribault. I have heard others complain of its being mild and rough. To me it has never been anything but beautiful. From that bright May morning in '56, with its 40 new, unpainted buildings and its 3 sawmills turning out lumber, which tomorrow would form shelters for those daily arriving, who by the end of the week had fairly earned the name and privileges of neighbors and friends. We soon found we had come where others had labored, and we might enter into the fruit of their labors." Quickly upon entering the fruits of their predecessors' labors, the Motts became active in public life. For a white settler to find success and survival in early Faribault, they had to truly be a jack of all trades. Most maintained subsistence farms, regardless of whether they were in town or on a proper farm. They had to have rudimentary carpentry and fix-it abilities. They had to possess certain interpersonal skills and a sense of contributing to the common good. Rodney Mott, Mary's husband, is an excellent example of these qualities. Rodney is credited as the first public school teacher in Rice County, a position he quickly took up upon coming to Faribault. He was at various times a newspaper editor, lawyer, district attorney, state legislator, probate judge, Rice County superintendent of schools, and was an essential early organizer of the Minnesota State Academies. When the Motts first laid eyes on Faribault in 1856, the town had only been officially in existence for 1 year. In 1855, the town was platted. Land was mapped out, divided, and prepared for official sale. Of course, there were people living in Faribault before it was legally recognized as Faribault. Alexander Faribault first came to the confluence of the Strait and Cannon Rivers in 1828. He established a trading post on a nearby lake before making a permanent settlement in what we now know as downtown Faribault. Alexander was a mixed-race young man with French-Canadian and Dakota heritage. With a kinship in both white and indigenous culture, he was well suited to be the patriarch of a multicultural city. The people Alexander settled here to trade with were the Wahpekute, a band of the Dakota Nation. The Dakota Oyate, the Dakota Nation, has been living on and stewarding Minnesota for untold generations. They were, and continue to be, an essential part of our town story. Without the contributions of the Wahpekute, the city of Faribault would not have come to be. Before there was the city of Faribault, there was Rice County, named in honor of Minnesota Senator Henry Mower Rice. The county government predates the city government by roughly 16 years. After much of the county, including the settlements of Northfield and Faribault, were platted out throughout the year 1855, a form of local representative government was needed. An election was held for Rice County's first commissioners, the people who would organize the government in its vital early years. Seeing as the county government was freshly created, they did not have a formal meeting place. The first meeting of the Rice County Board of Commissioners took place on January 7, 1856, at the office of Faribault attorney George W. Batchelder. Frederick Willard Frink was voted chairman of the first Board of Commissioners. Frink noted that his walk to Batchelder's office was bitterly cold that day. Years later, he remembered the fateful event. That first Monday in January, when I started for Faribault from my cabin in the woods before sunrise, the mercury in the thermometer was congealed. When I got to Faribault, the thermometer marked 31 degrees below on the sunny side of Mr. Batchelder's office door, but there was no sunshine then. In true Minnesota fashion, the first government in Faribault was born in sub-zero temperatures. F.W. Frink led the Board of Commissioners as they formally decided on Faribault as the county seat, organized school districts, and developed the county's roads. Frederick Willard Frink, who more often signed his name F.W. Frink, was a settler from Vermont. He was not yet 30 years old when he led the first Board of County Commissioners in 1856. He would serve his community in many public and private roles. At various times, he was a county commissioner, county auditor, Rice County superintendent, and deputy state examiner, among other positions. Frink frequently crossed paths with the aforementioned Rodney A. Mott, with whom he was a member of the Faribault Library Board and the Old Settlers Association. Because of his commitment to preserving and sharing local history through his prolific writings and speeches, Frink is often referred to as the historian of Rice County. In the fall of 1856, F.W. Frink introduced another first to Rice County, its first newspaper. The Rice County Herald was only the 35th newspaper created in Minnesota Territory. On October 22, 1856, owner and editor F.W. Frink published the first piece of local news in Rice County, keeping his fellow citizens informed and engaged in local developments. His stint in print journalism did not last long. After only 6 issues were printed, he sold the business to J.L. Pond. Pond was not interested in serving as editor, so he hired one Rodney A. Mott to fill the role. After one edition was made under this arrangement, Mott bought the business himself and stayed on as editor. As the new owner, Rodney Mott renamed the publication the Faribault Herald. One prominent feature of newspapers, especially back then, was the business cards pages. In this page from the July 23, 1857 edition of the Faribault Herald, we can find a plethora of familiar names. For example, we can see editor Rodney Mott's side hustle as a real estate agent in a well-placed ad at the top of the page. Further down, we come across the law office of our old friend George W. Batchelder and his new law partner from out east, Thomas Scott Buckham. Further yet is notary public and conveyancer F.W. Frink, whose office is located in the building of J.W. Tower and Brothers Store. It just so happens that across the page from Frink's ad is a note from that very store, the general goods store of George and James Tower. The brothers had founded the store in 1855. According to a 1910 history of Rice and Steele counties, this gives them the claim of being only the second store ever opened in Faribault. You may be wondering, why are we fixating on a handful of ads from this 1857 newspaper? Well, we will discover that the characters highlighted here will be some of the essential figures in the formation of Faribault's city government. This page illustrates the varied roles all of these gentlemen played throughout their lives. It also is one of the first pieces of evidence to show just how intertwined the lives of every one of Faribault's early settlers could be. The settlers in early Faribault were unique. Unlike many settlements in Minnesota, here there was no single dominant ethnic or cultural group. There were indigenous Minnesotans, French Canadians, Germans, Irishmen, and Old Stock East Coast pioneers, and they were eventually joined by Swedish, Norwegian, Czech, Dutch, and settlers of many other nationalities. These settlers practiced Catholic, Methodist, Lutheran, and Dakota belief systems. In the early days of Faribault's settlement, as F.W. Frink put it, it was necessary for all denominations to ignore sectarian distinctions and combine for the general welfare. In the 1850s, Faribault was a boom town. As Rodney Mott wrote in the Faribault Herald in February of 1857, "The avalanche of humanity and wealth upon this town took place last spring and extended through the summer." Rapid settlement and investment weathered the storms of economic panics, the U.S. Civil War, and the U.S. Dakota War. Faribault's position as the seat of Rice County government contributed to the avalanche of humanity it experienced. Some early leaders, like John W. North and James Shields, quickly left to pursue other ventures. Others, like Thomas Scott Buckham and George W. Batchelder, planted deep roots in Faribault and served the community for decades as it developed. As noted before, the lives of early pioneers were intertwined, and many roles could be played by the same combination of players over the decades. This made some of the early leaders of Faribault very close. Closer than you probably think. F.W. Frink recalls some of his early interaction with the esteemed Mr. Batchelder. "I think I may claim a more intimate acquaintance with George W. Batchelder in those early days, for in the crowded conditions of the hotels in the summer and fall of 1856, I occupied a part of his bed, while getting my printing establishment in order, and for 5 or 6 weeks we slumbered peacefully and soundly on our prairie feather bed." The practice of sharing beds in rural settlements was not uncommon at that time. It illustrates the intimate trust required between two leaders like Frink and Batchelder. The obituary of George W. Batchelder explained his early leadership. Mr. Batchelder in 1855 came to Faribault. At the time of Mr. Batchelder's arrival, Faribault was only a trading post of Alexander Faribault with the Dakota Indians, and contained but few white people. Mr. Batchelder took an active part in the work of organizing the county, dividing it into townships and school districts, laying out highways, and making Faribault the county seat. He was a member of the state senate in 1872-73 and procured the passage of the act giving to Faribault a city charter. Vitally, as Faribault grew, it became clear that a more robust government structure was required to serve its inhabitants. A grassroots effort developed to organize a new governing structure, one that would rely on the people of Faribault to be elected by and serve the interests of their neighbors. There were some rumblings of a citizens group organizing a charter as early as 1868, but a 1910 history of Rice County recounts the momentous 1870 scene. The government went on in an uneventful manner until the growing town began to realize that a city government was required. On January 22, 1870, a meeting of citizens was held for the purpose of considering the making of an application of a city charter. At the adjourned meeting, some 75 persons were present. On motion of R.A. Mott, a division was taken, which resulted in 39 in favor of incorporation and 36 against. With a slim majority, a mandate was given to local leadership. Faribault would have a city charter.
The charter, as I said, is what really lays out the form of government of how Faribault operates. That there's a mayor that is one of 7 votes. The mayor chairs the city council meetings, facilitates discussion, leads the discussion, but the mayor's vote is no stronger or weaker than the other 6. Other cities, their charters may lay it out a little different, where the mayor may not vote unless there's a tie, or the mayor may not chair the meetings, there's a council president. The mayor may have a veto power that the council then would come and vote over. There are numerous ways it can go together, but that's what our charter lays out, is just the basic structure of how it operates.
In 1872, George W. Batchelder began his term in the state legislature. On February 17, 1872, the Minneapolis Daily Tribune reported that he introduced a bill written by none other than F.W. Frink. The bill was an act to incorporate the city of Faribault. It was reported in the Lake City Leader on February 23rd that an act incorporating the city of Faribault has passed. The bill, signed by the governor on the 29th, provided for a special election to be held upon the question of its acceptance or rejection on the first Tuesday of April of that year. The voters of Faribault had the final say on whether or not the charter would be ratified. The charter wasn't the only thing on the ballot in 1872. Should a city government be approved, the city would require leadership. A mayor and board of aldermen would be necessary. On April 9, 1872, the charter was adopted by a 2-to-1 majority. On the same ballot, George W. Tower was elected the first mayor of Faribault. You remember the general store guy from the 1857 newspaper ad? I told you there was a point to that. In his inaugural speech, Tower called the young city, quote, the most promising place in southern Minnesota, end quote. Following George W. Tower, Thomas Scott Buckham was elected the next mayor of Faribault. In the ensuing decades, both George W. Batchelder and Rodney A. Mott would serve as mayor of the city they helped to charter. The historian of Rice County, F.W. Frink, describes in poetic detail the success of those pioneering leaders. Victories over a stubborn soil, wild waste into fruitful fields and happy homes, victories over ignorance and superstition best shown by the maintenance and prosperity of a free press and the public school, victories over the selfishness of human nature in devoting so large a share of our worldly goods in the relief of suffering humanity at home and abroad. And above all, it was a grand and glorious victory when the echoing of Sumter's guns found response in 1,000 brave hearts ready to give their lives for their country. These are the victories which gave assurance that government of the people, by the people, and for the people can longest endure supported and defended by a peace-loving, generous, and intelligent people. There was an emphasis in the years following the United States Civil War on endurance. Can a democratic society endure? Faribault had answered, yes, with changes to adjust to a changing world.
For the first 100 years, roughly, Faribault worked under just a kind of a different structure. It was a commission system almost. I can't remember if the city council members were elected in wards. I actually think they were. But each city council member would be in charge of a department. So one council member would be in charge of public works. One council member would be kind of in charge of the fire department, one in charge of the police department. There wasn't a professional city manager running the operation. As governments grew and evolved, that model just didn't work anymore. And frankly, I don't know of any city more than a couple hundred people that would have that type of structure anymore. So Faribault had to come up with a new structure. Faribault basically rewrote the charter in the early 70s to come up with what looks like what we have today. That there's a mayor, there are 6 council members that are all elected at large, which not all cities are like that. A lot of cities still do wards, but all the council members are elected at large. There is a city administrator. I remember when I was mayor, our administrator and I would often use the term that it's the hourglass management structure. Then the administrator is the narrow point in the middle of the hourglass. The mayor and city council are on the top of it. The administrator works for the mayor and city council. The rest of the city staff works for the administrator. That was the structure that came forward. And with some minor tweaks to the charter over the last, really close to 50 years now, that's the structure that we've got.
In the past, I think it was pretty much usual suspects of the same things were happening, the same people involved, and certainly doing the business of local government, but with limitations. This time period brought new eyes, if you will, to look beyond what was doing business in their normal ways and looking at community needs. And so with the community needs, there were so many opportunities.
I look at, before I got on council, we didn't have an ice arena, we didn't have soccer fields, we didn't have the senior center. There's so many things we did not have, and now I think we can compete with pretty much any city in terms of facilities that we have. As I know, there were some families who chose not to move here because we didn't have certain facilities that their kids might use. But I don't think they can really say that now.
All of these developments were made under the continual stewardship of the city charter, now celebrating its 150th anniversary. For 150 years, this document has enabled the development of a flourishing, diverse, and growing community. That same description would fit the Faribault of 1857 as much as it fits in 2022. Faribault is always in the process of getting more of the community to take part in local leadership, as well as recognizing when more needs to be done. This is nothing new. F.W. Frink wrote about this very challenge 150 years ago. Too little was said of the noble women who had torn themselves away from the endearing ties of early association, and without whose aid and assistance, all efforts to establish civilization here would have been futile. Indeed, the challenge of Frink's time continues to this day. Perhaps the biggest challenge in any community, such as Faribault, is to engage and recognize every area of development and leadership in our city. It's a job that will never be done, but whenever progress is made, it brings a new watershed of engagement. And by continuing to celebrate and promote civic engagement, we carry on the legacy of those early pioneers who gifted the people of Faribault the essential tool of a city charter. This is Sam Temple. Over the past year, I have had the pleasure of interviewing many of my Faribault neighbors. These people have served their community in various capacities, as city staff, elected officials, appointed volunteer commissioners, and as community organizers. They all have worked to fulfill the mandate set forth in 1872, a local government run and elected by the people. We opened up interviews for anyone to sign up. We encouraged anyone who had served the Faribault community to get involved and tell their story. In all, we interviewed the following people: Pat Rice, Jonathan Wood, Dean Purdy, Chuck Ackman, Roger Steinkamp, Pat Gustafson, Jeanette Hammond, Dave Albers, Pete Johnson, Ann Voss, Carl Voss, David Wanberg, Carrie Casper, Delon Musselman, Tim Madigan, Brendan Kennedy, and Tim Murray. Their interviews were used to form a series of short vignettes on the history of Faribault city government. They exemplify why we choose to celebrate the anniversary of the city charter, for all it represents and everything it has enabled. Like the Motts before us, contemporary civil servants have come where others have labored, and by continuing Faribault's heritage of public service, they enter into the fruit of their labors. What our forefathers understood was that there truly could not be a distinction between the residents of a community and its government. When rights are protected and community members are civically engaged, the government and the people should be one and the same, especially at the local level. Watch these vignettes to learn more about the last 50 years of public service under the Faribault City Charter, and visit a special exhibit at Faribault Heritage Days 2022 to discover the legacy of these civil servants and how their work is carried on today.